Hello, and thank you for joining. My name is Jennifer Hill, an education specialist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. In addition to hosting broadcasts, I have the honor of coordinating the Native Youth Climate Adaptation Leadership Congress, a week-long on-site program for Indigenous high school youth to grow in leadership, which we welcome you to learn more about. Before moving into our broadcast, I would like to acknowledge that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. While we have not found a full account, we are aware that many peoples traversed, cherished, and lived on this land, and they include the Massawamek, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. As we learn more about the Indigenous people who continue to have relationships with this land, we better appreciate the good earth on which we work, live, and learn. We pledge to grow and sustain relationships with the Indigenous communities through collaboration on our training, outreach, youth programs, museum exhibits, and more. But most importantly, we encourage others to learn more about the land on which you all work and reside. Now today, we'll hear from Chad Smith, who is a citizen and the former principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. He is also an author, historian, and visionary leader who has been a powerful force in building businesses and empowering Indigenous communities to be more self-sufficient. Chad has devoted most of his life to rebuilding the Cherokee Nation. When he was principal chief, the Cherokee Nation grew its assets from $150 million to $1.2 billion, increased healthcare services from $18 million to $310 million, created 6,000 jobs, and dramatically advanced its education, language, and cultural preservation programs. The Cherokee Nation's success is a direct result of his leadership. Throughout his career, Chad has taught Indian law and Cherokee legal history. He has served as a director of Tribal Justice Project, legal aid director, attorney general, and director of justice for many Indigenous peoples. Chad wrote Leadership Lessons from the Cherokee Nation, Learn from All I Observe, which was published by McGraw-Hill Education in 2013, and Building One Fire, Art and Worldview in Cherokee Life, which was published by University of Oklahoma Press in 2010. Chad has earned several degrees over the years from various universities. Chad, we are honored to have you join us today, and now I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. It was a very warm welcome. My topic today is consultation between the federal government and the tribes. And what I like to do is start with the fundamentals and go back to history. The Cherokees were located in Southeast United States for millennia. In 1830, Congress had basically adopted an Indian removal policy, basically to remove tribes of the east and the southeast, west of the Mississippi, so they wouldn't interfere with Western expansion. It was a troubling time because Georgia passed offensive laws to try to force the Cherokees out. For example, the Cherokee could not speak or testify in a Georgia court. The militia commandeered low-grade gold mines located in the Cherokee Nation. They required a license to be obtained by white ministers within the Cherokee Nation and pledge allegiance to the governor of Georgia. In the somewhat horrific environment, Cherokees decided to use their learning and the resources available to them and bring a case in the U.S. Supreme Court. So in 1831, in the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Cherokees beseeched the Supreme Court for protection from Georgia's offensive laws. and asked for an injunction. Cherokee showed up to court. Georgia thumbed its nose at the court and didn't show up. And so what the court found is that one of the fundamentals of federal Indian law is that the tribes were dependent domestic nations, and their relationship with the federal government was one of ward to guardian. Unfortunately, the case was dismissed for lack of standing. The Supreme Court said that tribes were not a state or a foreign country, therefore they could not sue Georgia. The following year, one of the missionaries that was serving in the Cherokee Nation, Worcester, brought the same kind of lawsuit against Georgia. And in this instance, there was proper standing. The Supreme Court held that Georgia had no authority over the Cherokee Nation, that the treaties of the United States were the supreme law of the land, and Georgia's statutory laws were subservient. They were inferior to this federal law. So the principle that occurred there and became the foundation of almost all Indian law is that tribes were dependent domestic nations. States could not assert their jurisdiction over the tribes while in that federal status, and the tribe had a relationship with the federal government of ward to guardian. And why that is important is particularly with the treaty process during this time, the definition of a treaty is an agreement. There are actually over 368 treaties with the United States and American Indian tribes. But look at the foundation or the purpose or the mechanics of a treaty is that it's a contract. It's an agreement. You've got two parties. One wants something, the other one wants something. Can they come to agreement for some exchange? And so in that mechanisms of developing an agreement, first there has to be notice. Each side has to know what the other side wants. Two, there has to be consideration. Each side has to give or give up something in exchange. And three, there has to be a meeting of the minds, an agreement. And four, that agreement needs to be memorialized. So not only the people at the table can rely upon that agreement, but those who follow do. So the idea of a treaty fundamentally is there's notice. There's an exchange. There's a communication. There's an agreement. There's a memorialization. Well, that proceeded from the 1830s up until 1860s. And if you recall American history, the East Seaboard and the Southeast was under a regime of colonial powers and then the United States in effort. And their policy effort was to civilize tribes and to remove them west of Mississippi. Now in the plains was the same civilization policy. But in that instance, in the plains instance, plains tribes scenario, tribes had large hunting grounds and they were nomadic. Many of them were nomadic people. So there was a number of wars in the plains. There was actually 46 wars between the tribes and the United States during this period of time. So the federal policy there was to negotiate peace, try to negotiate a cession of land from the tribes, allow the tribes to become more agricultural so they didn't need to hunt and fish the open prairies. They could learn to be farmers, and they would reduce their land claims and make the balance available for Western expansion. Well, that continued until 1866. And sometimes those of us that are a bit cynical think that a treaty is in the same class That is, the check is in the mail and I'll respect you in the morning. Because in 1866, there was a treaty with the Cherokee Nation. It was right after the American Civil War. The federal government extracted certain things in that treaty, for example, to settle tribes friendly and civilized within the Cherokee Nation's 14 million acres. That was basically northeastern and northern Oklahoma. Other provisions of that 1866 treaty that the Cherokees were fairly astute about negotiating was Cherokees could manufacture or grow items, export them outside the Cherokee Nation proper, and pay no tax. Well, 2 years later, 1866, 2 years later after the 1866 treaty, which is 1868, Congress, through the Department of Revenue, Internal Revenue, passed a law that said they would impose basically a sin tax any place within the Cherokee Nation. Not only within the Cherokee Nation, but any place in the United States, including the Cherokee Nation. Well, that sin tax included tobacco. And what Cherokees had done, particularly two, they started growing a low-grade tobacco and manufacturing, in essence, a chewing tobacco and exporting it outside the Cherokee Nation and paying no federal tax. And so they had a competitive advantage. It was one of the first smoke shop cases. So these two Cherokees, one was in Boot Knot, they were making some money selling tobacco outside the Cherokee Nation, not paying the federal sin tax, tobacco tax. Well, around 1870, Interior and the Revenue Department came in and seized Boot Knot's product, their money, their machinery, just a great IRS kind of sweep, and assessed them back taxes on the tobacco they'd sold outside the Cherokee Nation. They go to the Supreme Court, and Boot Knot was the first Indian to argue in the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the case of In re Cherokee Tobacco, the Supreme Court was confronted with this issue. There was, without question, a treaty right, 1866, that the Cherokees could export tobacco and not pay any federal tax. There was no dispute. 2 years later, Congress passed a general sin tax taxing that tobacco. So the question became, which control? The previous treaty or the subsequent statute? The U.S. Supreme Court said and ruled, whatever comes later controls. You're just SOL, Cherokee Nation, that Congress unilaterally by statute implicitly repealed your treaty right. And sometimes we call it the King's X, that Congress is not bound by their own treaties, and they can cross their fingers and put it behind their backs and say, well, we really didn't mean that. So the following year, it's 1870, the following year in 1871, Congress passed a one-line act deep in the bowels of an appropriation bill that said the United States will no longer enter into treaties with Indian tribes. One of the reasons for that was that the House of Representatives was a bit resentful and jealous of the Senate, because to have a treaty, you had to have the president or the executive department draft the treaty, and it had to be approved by the Senate. And the House of Representatives had no say. So after 1871, the dynamics between tribes and the federal government dramatically changed. There was no more treaties. There was no more foundational notice. In a treaty, feds had to tell you what they wanted. With federal legislation, since the tribes were really not a constituent of Congress, Congress didn't have to tell the tribes anything. Didn't have to give them notice. Didn't have to negotiate. Didn't have to get an agreement. Didn't have to memorialize agreement. Congress could just pass an act, and the tribes are stuck. Well, that policy proved to fail for a number of reasons. After 1871, Congress began a more intense allotment and assimilation policy to move tribes from hunting grounds to reservations and even smaller tracts of individual land called allotments. 1887, the General Allotment Act was passed, and tribes were basically given 160 acres each and told to farm. The 5 tribes in the Southeast was able to defer that terrible policy until 1898, and Congress passed the same provisions over the tribe and basically liquidated them. So there's a great assimilation effort. We're going to make the Indians like ourselves, whether they want to or not. And the policy ultimately failed. By 1930, according to the Marion Report, poverty, destitute conditions, health criteria had plummeted, and tribes were much worse off than ever. So beginning in 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act. It allowed tribes to reorganize, this time in more of a corporate model or sort of a strong mayor model. 2 years later, the same act was passed to include Oklahoma with the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. So for years and years, under this regime of the IRA or the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, tribal governments, the Bureau of Indian Affairs basically controlled the actions and assets of the tribes. It was frustrating for tribes. They were high patriots. They enlisted in record numbers in World War I, and in World War II were the highest decorated ethnic group in World War II. But still, Congress and the Bureau of Indian Affairs was treating them like second-class people. It was in 1975 they began a groundswell of change. President Nixon passed the Self-Determination Act, which allowed tribes to negotiate and take control of certain federal programs. The conflict at Wounded Knee in South Dakota brought consciousness to the conditions of Indian country. And then there was a case in 1976 called Harjo versus Kleppe. And in that case, the Creek Nation brought a case against the Bureau of Indian Affairs saying, you're unlawfully ignoring our tribal government. And the judge found in that case, absolutely they were, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had launched a regime for 70 years of bureaucratic imperialism designed to frustrate, debilitate, and generally prevent from functioning the tribal governments that were expressly preserved in 1906. So the 1970s and the 1980s became a huge, huge sea change. So Jennifer, did you have a question? I can't hear you, Jennifer.
Okay, I have a question I'm curious about, but I don't want to throw you off your storytelling.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, can you speak to how Chief Justice John Marshall's Indian laws affected what you were just telling us about with the story of so I'm backing you up a little bit, back to the 1800s. I don't know if that played an impact in what you were just describing to us at all, or if I'm kind of derailing your whole your whole story or not. If so, you can say, let's not talk about that. But I am curious because we've been taught that that's like the foundation of Indian law, right? For federal government employees.
And,
So
and
I just wanted to ask that question.
well, it is the 1830 Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case and the 1831 Worcester versus Georgia case. Those principles are the fundamental basis of Indian law. But also that case, when it talked about trust relationship, the federal government had a duty to the tribes to talk to them. If we're going to be your trustee, that we have the duty and the obligation, not only legally but morally, to talk to you, to listen to you, see what you want, get your ideas, get your intelligence, involve you. But what happened because of the civilization efforts, the allotment efforts, the forced assimilation efforts, up until 1970, the Bureau of Indian Affairs never, nor did the federal government ever talk to the tribes. In fact, it was a bureaucratic imperialism that the Bureau of Indian Affairs ruled with an iron hand. So 1970s, in that area, it changed the relationship of tribes to the federal government. And actually went back, and I'm glad you mentioned it, and actually started paying attention more to that principle espoused by John Marshall in 1830, that the relationship between the tribes and the federal government was one of ward to guardian. And to effectively discharge that duty, Congress needed to start talking to the tribes. And so the policy change was self-determination in 1970s. Let me just give you one example where this idea of bureaucratic imperialism not only went to the agencies, but to Congress, and why that consultation or notice is critical. In 2005, there was a Transportation Act bill. The short name is SAFE-T, but basically it provided for the development of roads and transportation. One of the provisions was the EPA's guardianship of when you're developing land or mining or drilling oil wells to make sure that the environment was in check. And at that time, the tribes in Oklahoma, there were 39 of them, several of them were very aggressive in helping the state and other agencies ensure that the environment was protected. But in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association, is a small oil and gas group of guys, approached Senator Inhofe and said, we don't want the tribes messing with the environment. They may make our work too difficult. They may increase the regulations. I know they're trying to protect the water and the land and the air, but we don't need them. And so what Senator Inhofe did, after the bill was ready for signature, at the last hour and the last minute, passed a midnight rider that basically said, EPA, you can't give environmental programs to tribes in Indian country. It's pretty raw, and it was wrong. And so it's a good example of why consultation is important. So modern consultation actually began in 2000 with Bill Clinton's administration. It's Executive Order 13175 in 2000. And basically, the consultation framework by that executive order was that tribes should be consulted, that each of the agencies should develop policies to effect consultation, that the agencies had a duty in their legal relationship of trust with the tribes to consult, negotiate, and try to work for a mutual agreement. That policy, and Jennifer, I've given you this paper. All these citations are in that paper. And I've also given you, you can distribute to the attendees, a Pawnee Nation consultation statute. But the consultation policy developed since 2000. But then in the Biden administration, basically the idea was that the agencies were slow walking the consultation, weren't fully engaged. So with Biden, in 2001, he issued the Presidential Memorandum on Tribal Consultation and Strengthening Nation-to-Nation Relationships. And there, it pretty much said we need to get our act together and start consulting with these tribes and make it a meaningful exercise, In result of that executive order and that memorandum, various agencies started enacting additional consultation policies. For example, Executive Order 13175/2121 developed a departmental manual to start developing best practices of consultation. And in 512 DM4, it advocates for developing a consensus-seeking model, a model where both sides are brought to the table. They can ascertain each other's position and find a resolution, an integrative resolution. And then, about the same time, the administration issued a best practices for identifying and practicing and protecting tribal treaty rights, reserve rights, and other similar rights in federal regulatory actions and federal decision making. That's 2022. And again, it gives guidance for each of the elements of consultation. And then something interesting occurred in 2022. There was a memorandum issued on the implementation of guidance of federal departments and agencies on Indigenous knowledge. And there they defined the body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, practices, and beliefs developed by tribes and Indigenous peoples through the interaction and experience with the environment. It is applied to phenomena across biological, physical, social, cultural, and spiritual systems. It is an ethical foundation, often grounded in social, spiritual, cultural, and natural systems, offering a holistic approach. So basically, this memorandum said, feds, agencies, particularly where there's land and water and air involved, some of these tribes have something to say. They're still connected with the lands. They've got legends and stories and observations that might be very helpful. The Aleutians and the Eskimos, they follow the glaciers daily. The Navajos are out in the plains. They know what's going out in the desert better than anybody. And so it's really a fascinating perspective to start paying attention to tribes. And let me just sort of tell you a fun story, is that it's a Cherokee story. At the beginning of time, man, plants, and animals, they all spoke the same language. It was a universal language. And so during that time, man would hunt, he would kill a deer, but he would have reverence and humility for the deer. He'd go over to the deceased deer, say the sacred formula, thank him for his sacrifice, and use every part of the deer. The hide, the hooves, the meat, And the deer spirit would acknowledge that this is just the way life is, and to some degree he was thankful that he could contribute to man's existence. Well, something started occurring. Uh, all of a sudden, man got greedy. He started killing for sport. He started killing for profit. He wouldn't say the sacred formulas. He wouldn't give deference to the deer or the rabbits or the bear that he would kill. He just killed indiscriminately, take the hides and leave the flesh behind. And there's some folks would say this correlated with the great exportation of deer hide in the 1730s from the New World to England. And in fact, in the southeast United States, there were over 300 deer hide exported during that time for uniforms in Great Britain. So the animals were distraught. And so they all came together and held a council. For greed, for profit, what are we going to do about him? So they all decided for each man, for each animal, each would create a disease. Deers created arthritis, fish created bad dreams, other animals created cancer, other animals created diphtheria. Every disease known to mankind was created by animals in that council. And so they were satisfied and they went on. But the plants also, they were in the midst of this, they were surrounding this animals council. And they held their own council afterward and they said, man has done nothing to us. He's treated us very well. What we'll do is that we'll create a cure from each one of us, from the disease that man gets that he rightfully deserves. So when he comes to us and talks to us in the universal language, we'll find him the cure. And so that was done. And so at that beginning of time period, whenever man got sick and he deserved it, he could go out and ask the plants for a cure. And it seems a bit sophomoric, but I think you would find that many scientists would suggest there's an organic cure for every disease known to mankind. And only if we have the intelligence, the historic knowledge, to equate those plants with the disease, that we could have cures for things we don't have today. So even that's a sort of a myth. It underlines the ideas that there's intelligence out there that if we can pay attention to, it would benefit us. The other development of tribal consultation. See, Jennifer, you have another question? I can't hear you.
I keep forgetting that. Okay, you told me you liked interaction, so I'm taking you up on this.
Please do.
All right. Well, first of all, I really like that story. I think it's very true. But secondly, I'm wondering regarding since the 1970s and some of the changes or some of the talks of changes, have you witnessed any changes on the ground regarding the federal government? Maybe you're getting there, but have you witnessed any changes in how the federal government has interacted with tribes in a positive way or in a more meaningful way? And maybe you're going to get to that, or maybe you haven't yet.
Well, actually, I could bring up my screen and show you my email. There's a guy named Chris Cheney from the Department of Labor, Department of Justice. Every week, he sends out an entire list of consultation hearings or notices or such. And I got one, I get them routinely from almost every federal agencies. And I just on a mailing list because I used to work for the Pawnee Nation. But the agencies are aggressively giving notice to tribes about issues and trying to pull them in. And to some degree, you would think, well, they're just following policy that the president has mandated, which is all right and good. But in another way, it's an enhancing and sharing resources so you can come to a better result. Indian Health Service has a very aggressive consultation policy, and so what it has done over the last 20 years is increase the quality of health care in Indian country. And so the longevity, the diabetes, all the other indexes are improving over time. It's just makes sense. Another policy that's developing out of the consultation is co-stewardship. For example, perhaps the tribe and the federal government can share resources in managing certain properties that each has an interest. And I'm sure the Fish and Wildlife has done this a number of times of contracting with tribes to do certain services and to share stewardship over different pieces of land or water or environmental concerns. Probably the last thing I would follow on or follow up with it, which is your question tees it up well, is that on the tribal side, for example, the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado, Walter Echo Hawkey is an esteemed legal scholar, and he was the president of the Pawnee Nation for a number of years. He's leading a project for a handbook on the Indian countryside of how to do consultation. And when he was at the Pawnee Nation and I was an attorney general there, he led and we developed an actual statute that the Pawnees enacted so it would make it easier for federal, state, and other tribes and agencies to consult meaningful consultation with the tribe and basically discern which consultation notices were routine and weren't of the major core policies that the tribal governments need to be concerned with. And so Jennifer, I sent you that statute, and you're certainly welcome to share it with the participants. But on that side, it was an effort on the tribes to make consultation simple, establish a point of contact, the process and the policies to achieve consultation were pretty much common sense, and I think it's quite workable. So with that, let me sort of stop and ask you to ask questions.
Okay, we will open it up to questions. If you have any, you can put them in the chat now. And we'll see if Rob or if Randy's here, he can plop those over into our chat for us. We'll give it a second. And Chad, if I could give you a virtual hug right now, I would. So just feel really blessed and honored.
While we're waiting for folks to maybe make a question, let me tell you the footnote to this Cherokee story I was told. I had a son who's like 10 years old. He had this excruciating pain in his joints. And he had strep throat. You know, all kids, they get strep throat, go to the doctor, they gave him this pink medicine, it clears it up in a few days and all's good. Well, after that, for about 3 weeks later, he started having excruciating pain that would migrate between all of his joints, his hip to his ankles to his knees. Went to a doctor and went to a specialist, talked to a PhD at the University of Oklahoma, and he said, you know, Indian kids have 12 times the rate of juvenile arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, in the general population. I said, well, that's interesting. And he says, they trace it back to mutant strain of deer in the Ohio Valley in the 1760s. So when you start lining up the Cherokee mythology, the demographic information about mutant deer in the Ohio Valley, and the exportation of deer hide in the 1770s through the 1760s, it really was sort of fascinating that, there was some basis for the mythology. And of course, my son got better. They found that he had a mutant strain of strep that affected the joints, and with the proper medicine, he got better quickly. But I always give those stories some credence.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's more than just interesting and coincidence. I think that's definitely truth value right there. Thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna mute real quick and just go over and see if we have some questions.
Well, let me just sort of give the finale, my conclusion. Basically, the value of government consultation of the tribes is for all governments, federal, state, local, and tribal governments, just to be good neighbors, to respect each other's rights and improve the quality of life for all in the entire community. Just common sense, being a good neighbor.
Thank you. Yeah, it just comes down to basic humanity, I think. And that's what people need to remember, and everybody is just a person, a human, and remember each other as being just another person. And how would you want to work with your neighbor or your another human and treat them with equal dignity and respect? It's what we try to remember. So we appreciate your time. I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so I think if we get any questions, Chad, I'll forward them to you. We want to thank you for your time today. I feel really honored that you shared your expertise with us. This was very interesting, and I think very worthwhile for our audience to hear this background information. It's really critical for our Department of Interior employees to understand this background and how it applies to our work today as federal employees and where we stand in working with tribes. So I really do appreciate this. Oh, and I do see one question that has come in, kind of unrelated, but did the flooding in North Carolina affect the indigenous lands or peoples there?
The eastern band
And I
of
know
Cherokees the eastern band of Cherokees is there in Cherokee, North Carolina, just west of Asheville, that got hit pretty hard. So you had some flooding, some loss of infrastructure, but they weren't hurt quite as bad as their neighbors to the east and north.
Okay. Yeah, I know lots of people have all those folks in the South in their prayers and their minds, for sure. All right, well, I think we will wrap up today's presentation, and we will remind folks that all of our broadcasts are recorded and available on NCTC's website. And if you wish to learn more about the series or be added to the listserv, all you need to do is just email myself. It's Jennifer_Hill@fws.gov. We always welcome your broadcast suggestions. All you have to do is email me, chat me, and we hope that you will join us next month, Wednesday, November 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to hear from Maria Carrillo She is with the National Park Service, and she's gonna speak about the National Park Service's Tribal Engagement and Climate Change webinar series and how you can learn more about that and get engaged with that. So again, Chad, thank you so much for your time, and thank everyone for joining us today. And we hope that you have a good afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.